Okay, good afternoon. A good Erev Shabbos, although I'm sure many of you are going to be listening to this only after Shabbos, so a good Tvach. And we're right now going to be doing the fourth day of the Daily Mitzvah, the fourth Shir, and this is the Rambam for Shabbos, for tonight and tomorrow. We are going to be concluding the Rambam's introduction to the Sefer Hamitzvos. We have the final 5 principles that the Rambam is using in his count of the 630 mitzvahs, how to get there, as we have learned in the previous days. And with that, we're going to be concluding the introduction. Tomorrow, we actually begin the count of the mitzvahs. So let us begin. The 10th principle is that if there's any mitzvah which needs a preparatory act, a prerequisite act before you're able to do the mitzvah, don't count that initial act. What are some examples of that? For example, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple, there's a mitzvah to have the lechem hapanim, the showbread. There's to always be bread within the tabernacle and within the temple. So the Torah says, "Lokach t'selos," and you shall take flour. Now, those words, "Lokach t'selos," says the Rambam, that's not a mitzvah. That is part of the necessary acts in order to do the mitzvah of the showbread, the lechem hapanim. So don't count the words "Lokach t'selos" as its own mitzvah. That is one example of that. Another example is the Torah says, "V'yichvei lecha shemen zayizach," and you shall take for yourself pure olive oil. And this was, of course, a necessary act in order to light the menorah in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash. So the Rambam says, don't count the mitzvah, "V'yichvei lecha shemen zayizach," you shall take for yourself olive oil, as a mitzvah. Rather, the mitzvah is, as the verse continues, as the pasuk continues, "Lahalis ner tamid." It's like that you could kindle an everlasting flame in the holy temple. So the mitzvah is to have the menorah, etc., etc. So any mitzvah, sometimes the Torah is going to do this. It's going to tell you a mitzvah, but in order to do the mitzvah, the Torah also tells you a few other important activities that you need to do in order to do the mitzvah. Only count the mitzvah itself, not the preparatory acts. Okay, the next principle, the 11th principle, is whenever there is a composite mitzvah, a mitzvah that is comprised of multiple elements, don't count each element as its own mitzvah. Rather, they are all counted as one mitzvah. The example that Rambam gives of this is, of course, the mitzvah of taking on sukkahs, the lulav and the esrog. That is where the Torah says you should take for yourself 4 different kinds: the lulav, the esrog, the hadas, and the rava, the myrtle branch, and the willow branch. So you could think, okay, there's 4 different mitzvahs there, 4 different things. Says the Rambam, no, it's really one thing. It's only one mitzvah. Now, the Rambam says this is a pretty obvious rule when it comes to mitzvahs, where you cannot do the mitzvah unless you have all the components. So, for example, if you're on sukkahs and you only have 3 out of the 4 species, the 4 kinds that the Torah tells you to take, but you only have 3, could you do the mitzvah? The answer is no. If one is missing, it invalidates, it obstructs the entire mitzvah. You can't do it. So there it's pretty obvious that this is not 4 different independent mitzvahs that happen to be coming together, but rather they're all part of one integral unit. But the Rambam says, it gets a little bit more tricky when sometimes you have a composite mitzvah, and the mitzvah actually works if one of the elements are missing. An example of this is the mitzvah of tzitzis, the mitzvah of wearing a talis. According to the Torah, there are 2 colors that need to be in a talis, in any tzitzis. There has to be lavan, white strings, and there has to be tchelas, blue strings. The Gemara says clearly that if one of the 2 colors are missing, you could still do the mitzvah. And indeed today, most of the Jewish world holds that you do not wear the blue coloring because we forgot exactly how to make it, where the dye comes from, to do the mitzvah of the Torah, the tchelas, of the blue coloring. So we only have white strings, for the most part, for most of the Jewish community, in the tzitzis. And the Gemara says clearly that's okay. If you're missing one color, it doesn't invalidate the rest of the mitzvah. Saddam says there it gets a little bit more tricky. Do we consider the white and the blue 2 separate mitzvahs, or are they one mitzvah? And the Rambam says in this case, if you look and study carefully, you'll see that they're actually one mitzvah because they're really the same exact concept. They're all part of tzitzis. Tzitzis is one point. The point of tzitzis is to remember all of the mitzvahs of the Torah, and therefore these 2 components are part of that one mitzvah. They're not 2 separate things. But the Rambam says you have to sometimes use a lot of wisdom and a lot of discernment to understand when 2 components are 2 separate mitzvahs or when they are simply part of one mitzvah. The next principle for today, the 12th principle of the Rambam, is like this. Anytime there's a mitzvah that has multiple steps of action, Don't count every step of action separately. They're all part of one mitzvah. The example that Rambam gives of this is that the Torah tells us there's a mitzvah, the Torah of Asuli Mikdash is a mitzvah that Jews should make for Hashem a mikdash, a temple, a tabernacle. This is one of the mitzvahs of the Torah. There should be a house where the Hashem's presence goes into, and that's where Jews come to connect to Hashem, and that's where we celebrate the holidays, and we bring the sacrifices there, and it's wonderful. Okay, but then the Torah goes on in a full parsha with many, many specific instructions to make this vessel, make that vessel, and all these specific additional activities. So all these additional activities is the making of all the additional elements of the mikdash. Are they separate mitzvahs? Says the Rambam, no, it's one mitzvah. So too, the mitzvah of a korban, of bringing a sacrifice. So there's different kinds of sacrifices. Each one's a separate mitzvah. But if you take any one kind of sacrifice, a korban asham, for example, a sin offering, if you look, there's many, many steps of exactly how to do it. So in order to do the mitzvah, you're doing multiple different steps in a sequence. The Rambam says they are not all separate mitzvahs. They are one mitzvah. And the Rambam says that this is an area where there have been mistakes in some of his predecessors and their version of the 630 mitzvahs, that sometimes they take details of a mitzvah and they separate them and count them as their own mitzvahs. And the Rambam says that is a real big mistake that makes a lot of confusion, and that's no good. That's what happens, the Rambam says, when you just read the Torah and you don't actually think it through. You have to sometimes really, really think it through, and you can't allow your first reading to give you a final impression. That's what the Rambam says. Sometimes you have to really read it once, get the first impression. They have to think it through. What I just studied, is that a detail of a mitzvah, or is that its own mitzvah? Okay, the next principle, the 13th principle, is that the mitzvah still remains one mitzvah, even if it is repeated multiple times throughout the year. So we have mitzvahs that it's a mitzvah, but we do it either for many days in a row. For example, sukkahs. There's a mitzvah to eat in a sukkah, and we do it for 7 days. There's a mitzvah to shake the lulav and the esrog. We do that for 7 days. But then we also have mitzvahs that don't happen in sequence, but they happen sporadically throughout the year. We bring a special musaf, a special additional korban, an offering, in honor of Rosh Chodesh. Well, Rosh Chodesh, the new year, the new month, sorry, the first day of the month comes around 12 times a year, or 13 times a year, if it's a leap year like this year. That's 13 different times that you're doing the mitzvah of the korban musaf for Rosh Chodesh. Is that 12 mitzvahs? Says the Rambam, no. It is only one mitzvah, even if it is repeated. And another example that Rambam gives is that there's a mitzvah to come to make the pilgrimage on the three Shalosh Regalim, on the three main biblical holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, that every single Jew should come to the Holy Temple. So you're doing a mitzvah 3 times a year, but it's still only one mitzvah. Don't count it multiple times. Okay. Continuing on with the final 14th principle, which is how to count punishments. Well, there are consequences in the Torah, and the Rambam says there's all different kinds. Sometimes there's a monetary penalty. Sometimes, if somebody's found guilty and there's enough evidence, there's malchus, that the high court is going to give lashes to the offender. Sometimes it gets even worse. Sometimes there's a capital penalty, a death penalty, and there's 4 different ways how, if the burden of proof, the burden of evidence, which is extremely high in the Torah, is brought to a court, to a Jewish court, then the offender is even put to death. Sometimes the punishment is that Hashem will take care of it. It's not for human intervention. If this person needs to die, he will die at the hands of heaven, etc. So the Rambam says each form of punishment is only one mitzvah, even though they are being given to the violation of many different mitzvahs. But it still only counts as one. So if there's a mitzvah called malchus, chiyuv malchus, even though that malchus is given for many, many mitzvahs, you only count that as one mitzvah. And the Rambam says it's pretty obvious, because if you're going to count the punishment for every single mitzvah as a separate mitzvah, that gives you an additional over 400 mitzvahs. And that obviously doesn't work. It takes you way over the number. And the Rambam again calls out some of his predecessors that sometimes make the mistake of counting the punishment for a sin as a separate mitzvah, which is wrong. Okay, the Rambam with that concludes his 14 principles, and the Rambam gives his final thoughts, his final words for his introduction. The Rambam says like this, that he's going to now begin counting the mitzvahs, explaining the basic idea of the mitzvah and the name of the mitzvah. The Rambam also says I'm going to add a few little details. The Rambam is always going to be telling us what the punishment of the mitzvah is if it is violated. The Rambam is going to tell us when a mitzvah does not apply to women and only to men. And the Rambam is going to tell us if there's any limitations of the mitzvah in time or space. Meaning, is this a mitzvah that is only done in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land, the land of Israel, and not done in the diaspora? Or is it a mitzvah that is only done in the times that we have a Beis Hamikdash standing in Yerushalayim, or not? Unless, says the Rambam, unless it is pretty obvious otherwise. But for the most part, he's going to be sharing with us these details. And with that, says the Rambam, let us get going. We're going to begin. And with that, we conclude today's Sefer Hamitzvos. Tomorrow night, Sunday, Mitzvah Shabbos, we begin actually learning the Sefer Hamitzvos. And I want to welcome you all and encourage all of you to join along. Don't miss a single day as we begin our journey to study through the 630 Mitzvos of the Torah. Have a wonderful Shabbos or Gudvach, a wonderful week. We will see you all soon. Sei gesund.